Going to continue with the Grasshopper Rhino, the ABCs 1, 2, 3s edition. We're flying through most of everything. We'll try and get to the transformations in this series, but it's pretty basic. It gets every node up and running, and I hope you find it useful. It's a little basic, maybe extremely basic, but I find it essential to learn. So I'm going to apply these kind of as a tools to show people how to get every node running. What I have is I've gone into definitely taken this into the surface tools, and I've done all the primitives, and now I'm going to go into the freeform and get every one of those up and running. And I put a couple of interesting scripts in here to make them a little more exciting than as basic as they can be. So what I've done is we'll jump in here. I have some curves that I've had to bring in and use at times. We'll just tuck those away. Basically, I bring in a sphere. I put on a radius so we can actually see it. I populate that with 4 points. I make those index numbers and I send those into a 4-point or 3-point surface. So there's a 3-point surface that can be seeded and changed as we move throughout the points in that populated space. My finger's a little clumsy right now. You see how that changes? And I can always take in the 4th point, and then you have something that's more of a saddle form because 3 points are always going to make a planar system, and 4 points very rarely will make a planar system. But that's a way to start. And then the other tool is the 4-point surface. Oh, I had it in contrast to it. So I had the 4-point and I had the 3-point here. And because I've got this on, it's kind of hard to grab everything. So if you want to grab left to right, you have to leave the grouped color in order to select things. But basically you have a 3 and 4-point here. As we change it through seeds, you can see it iterate. It's grabbing both the 3 and 4-point. That said, that's enough. Let's keep going. Let's jump down to surface from points tool. So I grabbed basically the surface from points. I've grabbed those 4 points and made some shapes through it. I've allowed a 2U count that matches with the number of points, and if you obviously change the number of points up here, you're going to throw that script to fail. But if we take those points up to 23, you're going to find as you find your UV count, at some point, the UV count can actually make these things run, as long as it pairs up with it. So as I go through, where is it? Took my U count up to an odd number, which is probably not so great. Let's just grab something that works. Sometimes I have to zoom in to get something decent. I think it's 20 it's running. There we go. So now you have a very strange geometry being made from 20 points at a U and V count, probably 4 by 5 it would run as a U count, and you've got 2 different geometries that are happening because I've actually taken this as a sort point tool. So that was fairly interesting to think about having those points, bring them into a surface, but if I sort those points, I get a different surface. So you go from this one to this one. So just kind of playing around a little bit. Basic one is to grab a circle with a radius and throw on a boundary surface. That's used quite a bit to stay kind of simple in what you're doing, and we'll use that a little later on. Control point loft is interesting. What are my curves that I've put into my control point? I've actually internalized them, but if I pull them out, you see I have these crazy curves that are going to provide curves to actually do a control point loft in, and it provides something totally different. And the degrees can be played with as you play through that. I think your choices are from 0 through, it gives you, I guess you can go as many as you want in the degrees, but I wouldn't push it past 3. That's probably enough. I have an edge surface, which is nice, and I have 4 curves. So I'll just, I have to select them this way, which is a little bit of a pain in the butt because I'm in a grouped system. And there's my 4 curves, and I've grabbed a surface from those 4 curves, edge surface. So that's kind of an interesting thing if you think about the edges actually being outside of that form. And you end up with a untrimmed surface in that situation. A fit loft is kind of interesting if you take a look at it. A little different. I haven't brought it into the 4th element, but if I bring this one in as a curve, it starts to wrap itself around. You have to match your UV count to those fit lofts as well. As long as your degrees of your U and V are less than the amount of edges that you have, I think it functions. And it should tell you that by going in here and clicking help and reading. Try and get every node up and running so your head can kind of wrap it around it. A simple loft's pretty simple. And I can grab this as a loft point, and that's going to cause some confusion. But let's grab this curve and see what affects it. See if we get a nice loft. We get a twisted kind of torque loft there. And there's a lot of loft options you can do. From points, you can go all the way through from normal, loose, tight, straight, and uniform. You can refit it, you can rebuild it, you can adjust it, and you can leave it open or closed. Some people don't use the loft options. They just go in here and do the simple loft options. So if this is off, you can right click here and you get manage loft options. And even though I've got split screen, I've got to come over here to share it. loft options that are available are closed, aligned, and then you have a chance for going in and choosing loose, tight, uniform, straight, developable, and same thing continues with that. So it's your preference to how you want to deal with tolerance and things like that. What I find is this one's great, and this is just a nice little surface that I use. Pretty cool that I've grabbed a bunch of curves, and I'm probably going to just grab this and unselect group so I can actually get in here and grab these things. Those are my curves that I'm playing with, and I've merged them into these curves, and I've merged another set of curves into these curves, and I've allowed myself to have UV curves, deal with continuity, and build a loft network, which can build some really nice forms. And I'm having a lot of fun with that recently, as I've kind of played with that. Continuity affects it slightly as you play through it. It's a very subtle little change as you go through it. I'll leave it on 3, which should function. And you end up with some really nice forms that you can go around and make use of. So I'm just going to go here. I think if I zoom out, it's going to zoom out to my farthest script. So probably wasn't a great idea to do that. But there you go. You can start to see the geometry that's made from the network surface, which I find is a much better tool to be using, especially since you're going to be building from curves. A couple of simple things here is I've got a ruled surface that comes in, worth playing with from 2 curves. I have another ruled surface here from another set of curves, and I just brought in a few different sets that you can see by choosing different curves. You end up with these kind of different lofts that happen, or network surfaces that occur through it. So the ruled surface can be an interesting tool between 2 curves if you want to use it. The sum surface is interesting because it actually takes the curves and adds them together and does some really interesting geometries with them. I would say play with those. And of course, these are all dependent on curves that you might want to bring in. So I would say build some, and while you build some curves that you want to use, take those curves and make sure you pop them onto a layer and put them into something like curves, so you can reveal them at any time and have them disappear at any time. That way you're not dependent on visibility, putting on everything that's in your screen and then trying to take out everything that's in your screen. So you've got them on a layer that you can handle that. So I'm just going to get those all away. Sorry. Let's tuck those away. There we go. And that said, let's continue through extrude some surface, what I went on to. Then I've got some curves that basically are extruding, and I'm extruding up through that simple curve through the Z direction, which is how basically people think about doing extrusions. I think it's more important to play with the tangents and have some fun with that. Extrude linear is kind of cool. So here's one that I actually was able to build a vector, and I kept it in the same vector direction, but you're extruding really nicely through that and having control over that. And if you end up doing an evaluation, isotrim, and surface closest point, you can end up making some nice tangent vectors that keep these things from following the same vector every time you want to follow the normal vectors coming off of surfaces that aren't planar. Hope that makes sense. Extrude to point's pretty cool. You just pick a point, and I've adjusted that point, I believe, in the height of it, and it takes all that extrusion and funnels it into that point. It's a nice way to end with some geometries or surface planes that you want to finish or cap, but cap differently than round or point or flat. Kids are acting up a little bit. I also wanted to show the difference between a fragment patch, which actually looks the same as I make a fragment patch here dealing with curves and a boundary. There's a subtle difference between that and the boundary surfaces, but you've got to change up your boundary to kind of really explore that. Otherwise, you're probably satisfied with just boundary surfaces and what you're doing. The patch tool is pretty cool. I always use that in Rhino when I was actually modeling in that, but here's my curves I'm taking to it. I'm taking 2 and doing a patch curve here, and if you actually take it to a bake, you'll see what the patch looks like. It's kind of ugly. There it is. It has its counts. It's not too ugly. I mean, you can play with you can pull it in from points. You can also deal with how many spans you want in there. I think it defaults to 20. That's why we have so many here, 20 here and 20 there. But you can play off of that. You're not going to see them like a mesh line, so you have to bake it to kind of see what you've got. So I'm not really ending up visualizing that. But play with different curve sets. If you pulled in this curve set and this one, it's probably going to be a totally different form. There we go. If I play with this curve set, bring in a third curve set, it's probably going to do something as it brings a patch between all 3 of those. And once again, we'll take a different bake just to have a visualization of that. And there you go. You got the same thing that's doing a span and stretching. Close that out again. Pipe is pretty cool. I just took a curve and piped it. And then I did something interesting. Well, the variable pipe I love because I end up using, as long as you have the same amount of parameters as radii, and you set your parameters from 0 to 1 and reparameterize your curve, you can get some really nice organic lines that have been piped. And I use this tool all the time. Simple little trick there. The next thing I have here I should make it a little bigger, is I have sweep one rail, which is pretty simple. The only thing I've had to do is I've had to orient my geometry, my circle on the end of those lines. So if my line is actually here, if I take that curve here and I want this object here, well, I've got to orient that onto the surface first, and there it is. And as long as it follows that, I can then take it through a sweep and follow it. Here's a little script that I find very interesting, and I made my fantasy bridge with it, which I just oriented another way when I was done. But I really like this, that I have a curve and I have a secondary curve, and then I'm able to orient my circles over onto those forms at one side and the other. And as I do my twisted sweep one way and the next, I end up with this really cool geometry that became this kind of fantasy bridge for myself. And that might not make a lot of sense to people, but I enjoyed it. I'm going to bake it together, and then I have an object that I can take in a rotation, and I have a pretty cool thing. I'm just going to leave it here, and you can see in a simple render, I've got a pretty cool geometry for a bridge. Maybe I'll put it into all angles so you can see it. Right angle, front. So that's kind of a cool little geometry that I've been playing around with. So you end up making scripts while you're learning these nodes. You might actually want to keep them as your basic form. Let me shrink back out of here. I'm trying to get this sucker twisted around. There we go. End up with this kind of strange bridge. And it is closed. Pretty interesting geometry. The other one is rail revolution, which is pretty cool. You take a curve. We'll have to leave my fantasy bridge, go back to something I can actually see. Take my rail and use a rail revolve. So I took a curve beforehand, and I'm going to flow that along revolve it along that type of curve. And I end up once again with a pretty cool piece of geometry that you can think about how that actually worked as a rail form. You can come up with some pretty cool things. Otherwise, you've got a rail revolve, and I just chose a simple axis straight up, and I took a circle, and in choosing that circle, or that point, and doing a revolve, I think my curve was basically a circle. One way to do that, if you don't want to chase it around, is internalize it, externalize it, take a look at what it was. It was a circle on that. Actually, I didn't revolve it around that. That would be interesting to revolve it around. No, it's not going to function as an axis. I'm just functioning around that axis and making a sphere. So kind of the construction of a sphere. So that's a lot of information. You end up with a couple of new scripts that are kind of fun to play with. Pop it in here, send it in a group, and we're going to go into analysis tools for surfaces, which are going to get pretty tricky as to what we can do with them. We'll pull some interesting little tiny scripts out when we do that. We're at 13 minutes. I best stop. And what I do is just get this prepped and ready for the next session, and we'll keep building these, and I'll make sure these script files where all the nodes are running are up on my GitHub. Thanks for watching, and thanks for your patience. I'm doing this more for me and my class.